No one would doubt that fellowship, hospitality, and discipleship were important activities in the early church. We see their fingerprints all over the book of Acts and in the other writings of the New Testament as well. But what might surprise us is Dr. Elijah Brown's observation that these three activities were intimately related to one another. Moreover, he asserts, and I think rightly so, that for us to have the kind of impact on our world that they had on theirs, we will need to rediscover the relationship between fellowship, hospitality, and discipleship. Now let's begin, at the beginning, with the basics. Fellowship. What is fellowship? There's a Greek word, koinonia, which is often translated fellowship or partnership. What does it mean? What are the biblical writers trying to describe there? Well, there's really two elements. They're talking about a close association of persons who possess these two elements. First, common interests. Now, we don't mean common interests in the sense of common avocations or common hobbies, although it can include that too. We mean common interests in the sense of they are invested in the same thing. Okay? And that investment that they share in common in the same thing, whether that thing be something as trivial as a sports team or something as significant as a religious identity or a national identity, those common interests produce in them an instinct towards sharing. Sharing things in common. Those things might be actual material goods, like their stuff, their food, their money, their land, whatever. It might include more like social goods, just spending time together or whatever. But there's always an element of sharing in it, and it is a deeply psychological experience. Fellowship is something you know in your bones. So imagine for a moment that you're traveling and you're a big Texas Rangers fan and you have some of your Texas Rangers gear with you. And one day you are walking down the street in Manhattan wearing your Texas Rangers jersey, right? And you see somebody else walking down the street towards you wearing the same gear that you're wearing. All of a sudden, there is this rush of positive emotion, isn't there? Because, especially when you see him wearing his cowboy boots and his cowboy hat, you immediately think, hey, this is one of my people. And the next thing you know, you're talking to the guy, and he's like, hey, what are you doing here? I mean, the two of you don't know each other from Adam. But it's sort of like, well, what are you doing here? Well, I'm just here on vacation. What are you doing here? Oh, I'm here on a business trip. Hey, there's this really good deli just around the corner. Why don't you come have lunch with us? Right? That's fellowship. Maybe you've experienced this religiously. There have been times that Natalia or myself, we've just met somebody in a store And you can just tell by their language, by their body language even, by their disposition, they have something in common with you. Now, the interesting thing about fellowship is that fellowship is something that just is, okay? The Bible takes it as a given. And yet, it is also something that we're supposed to cultivate. You'll remember our sort of overarching passage for this entire series, Acts 2, 42 through 47. It begins by saying that the disciples devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, and to prayer, right? So fellowship is something that is both a given, it's both a foundational reality and something that we build upon, something that we cultivate, something that we fan into flame. Because here's the thing, if you just kind of are walking down that street in Manhattan and you happen to see that guy wearing the cowboy boots and the cowboy hat and the Texas Ranger shirt, and you just kind of go, meh, kind of look down and walk away, you've lost an opportunity, haven't you? And there actually won't be that positive rush of emotion of, there's my people. There's my people. No. That person will think, gosh, I guess they're not one of my people, right? Now, what is one of the primary ways that we build fellowship? Well, it is through hospitality. It is through hospitality. That's what we see in our passage this morning. Priscilla and Aquila are still bumping around the synagogue. They haven't been run out yet for whatever reason. Maybe they were more, I don't know, maybe they had more tact than Paul. I don't know what it is, but they haven't been run out and stoned and beat yet. So they're at the synagogue and they see this Apollos guy show up, right? And so what do? They take him home, which that implies a meal. Okay? Now, hospitality is, frankly, we don't do a very good job of it in our culture. Just yesterday, we were talking to a friend of ours who just got back maybe a month ago from a trip to Ghana. And she was like, man, those people were welcoming and, way different than the United States. It was I think an eye-opening experience for her. We don't do hospitality very well in the United States. But in the ancient world, hospitality was a practical necessity. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is that travel just wasn't as easy as it is in our day and time. And we don't just mean that they didn't have cars and they didn't have good roads. What we mean is that even the architecture of travel, restaurants, hotels, all of that kind of stuff, just either didn't exist or it was very, very different in their day than it is in ours. Money just wasn't as prevalent, And so when you traveled, you really needed somebody to take you in, okay? And the other thing that somebody taking you in did was that automatically gave you protection in this new city where you're at. Because you're traveling, that means you don't belong to that city. It makes it more likely that you're going to be victimized, either by local officials or by the local criminal element. Okay? So that's one reason that hospitality was a practical necessity. But another reason had to do simply with the economic realities of the Roman world. The vast majority of people were painfully poor. And it was incumbent upon those who had resources to use those to assist other people or to host gatherings and such. Now, this is also a reciprocity culture. We'll talk about that in a moment. So it's not like you didn't get anything out of it, but it was sort of your responsibility as a wealthier member of society. Now, let me just illustrate that for you this way. You know, our apartment, our apartment is 936 square feet. There's plenty of room for the two of us, and we have a pretty decent library. We have multiple rooms. We have indoor plumbing. If you lived in an apartment building in one of Rome's many cities, especially if you lived on the upper floors, which the majority of people did, you basically had just enough room to lay down and go to sleep. Many of those apartments did not even have a way to cook. Now, if they did, they might have a little coal-fired little kind of oven thingy, But you don't have a whole lot of room to stuff a whole lot of people into, your apartment. You're not going to be hosting Bible studies. You're just not, because you don't have the capacity. It's absolutely vital that the wealthy people in your congregation be hospitable. Now, hospitality is also a gift. We'll come to that in a moment. But it is something that in this culture was a practical necessity. And because of that, it was also a cultural value. Hospitality was seen as a reflection that you shared the values of the people around you, and that you valued them. Now, of course, you did get something from it, and that something you got was honor. Okay? And it was incumbent upon those who received your hospitality to praise you publicly, right? That's what honor is. It's public acknowledgement of one's worth. But hospitality was this cultural value. But here's what we've observed around here. Just because something was a cultural value does not necessarily mean that it's something we ought to do. The Bible is canonical, not necessarily the culture in which it arose. But the thing is, hospitality is also an ecclesiological imperative. An ecclesiological imperative. Now, what does that mean? It means that by the very nature of the church, hospitality is demanded. Hospitality is required. It's very interesting. Hospitality is specifically commanded by both Paul and Peter. Romans 12, 9 through 13, 1 Peter 4, 8 through 10. And what you see in both of those texts is that the command to be hospitable is also closely associated with the command to love. And to love with a particular kind of intensity, a particular quality. In Paul's case, let love be sincere. In Peter's case, love one another deeply. That's the context in which each of these apostles set this command to be hospitable. We are all members of one another, is what Paul says in another one of his letters. We are all members of one another. We all belong to the same family. So hospitality is just part of the deal. You wouldn't be inhospitable to your own body. You wouldn't be inhospitable to your own family members. So Hospitality is part of what binds us together as God's people, as Christ's body. This welcoming of one another into our homes and into our lives. But what we see in our text takes us even a step further. Hospitality is the context for relationship building and for ministry. What we see of Priscilla and Aquila in this text is not the first time that they've taken somebody home. It's not the first time that they have taken in a stray. When they were in Corinth, they did the same thing for Paul. And all of a sudden you have this partnership in ministry. Well, here they take Apollos home. They take Apollos home. And Apollos is discipled by Priscilla and Aquila around a table, around a meal. That's not surprising to us if we think back to the Gospels. What was Jesus always doing? He was always eating somewhere, and he was always ministering in that context. Right? So hospitality is this context in which we build relationships with one another. It is, in a very real sense, the way that we reinforce fellowship, but it does even more than that. So let's think about discipleship for a moment, okay? Why is discipleship? Why is discipleship so easily associated with notions of fellowship and hospitality? Well, part of the reason is because of the what of discipleship. Okay, the what of discipleship. Now, we're not going to go into this in detail, but I want to kind of touch on some things. I've got a couple of articles coming in the Baptist Standard over the next 3 or 4 weeks that will help you understand a little bit more detail about what I'm talking about. Part of what we are talking about, part of the reason that discipleship is so intimately related to hospitality, part of the reason that the table is such a good context for discipleship is because of the nature of discipleship. Discipleship is not simply about orthodoxy, although it is about that. Orthodoxy meaning right thinking. Right thinking, okay? But it is also about orthopraxy and orthopathy. Okay? Orthopraxy simply means right practice, right conduct, a right pattern of behavior. And that includes, yes, ethics, but it also includes worship. Okay? Orthopathy, that's a little harder to define. I guess linguistically it would be right feeling or right disposition. Okay? But orthopathy describes our self-understanding, who we see ourselves to be, our aspirations, our motivations, our responses to stress or temptation. It has to do with all of those soft skills that are really not stored in the logic centers of our brain. They're in that right hemisphere, that part of our brain that's harder to train, that part of our brain that doesn't always yield to logic. Let me illustrate why orthopathy is so important to orthopraxy and even to orthodoxy. Diane Langberg is a almost legendary figure in the field of Christian trauma therapy. She was actually one of the very first psychologists to start doing that work in the early 1970s. And once Langberg had made her reputation, she started having opportunities to teach seminary students. And she would go and guest lecture, or sometimes even teach entire courses. And she would put this scenario before her mostly male seminary students. Just say, okay, I want you to think about this. Imagine that you are in your office one day and a beautiful 26-year-old parishioner comes into your office, closes the door, and starts taking off her clothes. How are you going to react? And after the nervous looks started going around the room, and guys are looking at each other and looking down at their notes and doing everything they can to not make eye contact with her, right? She would say, how you react in that situation says more about your fitness for ministry than just about anything else. Now, sometimes she'd get some pushback on that, right? Because there'd be some guys in the class who were honest enough to admit, I don't think I can control myself in that situation, and I don't really like the idea of being held accountable for it, right? And so they would push back and say, wait a minute, that's not really fair. That's not fair. You're judging me for something I can't control. And she would say, like, look, you've got to be able to control that. Now, why? We're all older here, and many of y'all are women, so we can extract ourselves from the emotion of that situation, right? And we can understand why. I may be blind, but I'm not this blind. I know that any woman of that age who walks into my office and starts taking off her clothes is mentally ill. Right? Okay? And that's just generally true anyway, right? That's just not how people behave. I mean, even when I was a lot younger and had a lot more hair, nobody was volunteering to do that. That's just not how people work. And so when they do, you can't see, woohoo, this is my lucky day. You have to see, whoa, we have a problem. And it is my responsibility as a minister of the gospel to administer healing as best as I possibly can for this obviously wounded soul, and not to prey upon that wounded soul for my own gratification. Right? Do you see what she's getting at? And that's not something you can logic your way through in the moment. It has to be the kind of thing that somebody pokes you in the middle of the night and it just comes out your mouth. Right? Like the Pillsbury Doughboy, just they poke you in the belly and out comes, how can I help? How can I minister? How can I protect you from yourself, from other predatory people, and from me? So this is what discipleship is about, right? But if it's about all of this stuff, if it's about not just our doctrine, but the ways that we think about life, and if it's about not just our thinking, but it's about our reactions to stress, our reactions to temptation, if it's not just about the way that we worship, but it's also about the way that we live, that's a big task, isn't it? And it can't simply be done through information transfer. It's not simply something where I can stand behind this pulpit and just, grab my garbage can full of information and dump it on you, and all of a sudden, you're discipled, right? So, the second part of our answer, why is discipleship so intimately related with fellowship and hospitality, is the how of discipleship. Yes, there is a didactic element. That means teaching or instruction. There's a didactic element to discipleship, just like what I'm doing this morning. But there's also a dialogical element. There's a place for interchange, for interaction, for asking questions. Strangely enough, y'all don't all think like I do. Can you imagine that? Which means you're going to ask questions that I never even thought of, right? And we are all strengthened by those questions. Conversation is something that oftentimes is best done over a meal. But it is certainly best done in the context of this sense of fellowship. So let's go back to our cowboy walking down the street of Manhattan who has a Texas Rangers garb on. You're sitting there, you're talking to him over lunch, and you're like, so what? Why are you here? Oh yeah, I work in the finance department for the Texas Rangers. I was a AA player for them. That's as high as I got. I just didn't have the talent to do any better, but they let me do some scouting, but they also let me do some finance because I did a degree in finance in college. They're like, oh, hey, can you explain such and such to me? Right? Okay, well, why is it that 20 years ago I never heard anything about launch angle, but now that's all anybody talks about? And they're, oh yeah, and so they talk you through it, right? That's how this works. But there's another aspect to the discipleship task. Discipleship is didactic, it's dialogical, but it's also mimetic. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means exactly what we have said around here all along. People learn how to be human by watching other humans. They also learn how to be disciples of Jesus, for good or for ill, by watching other disciples of Jesus. So think about it this way. One of the ways that especially younger disciples of Jesus learn how to practice hospitality is when they see hospitality in action, right? When they see you doing it. When they see how you receive others into your home and care for them while they are there. That's where they learn what it means to practice hospitality. But the thing they really learn, hopefully, is that when you receive someone into your home, what you're really doing is receiving them into your heart. Because one of the things that we learn as Christians about hospitality is that hospitality is more than just a welcome into a space. It is a welcome into one's own heart. Now, let's take all that data and let's put it together, okay? Let's see how this all works, okay? Now, there's a basic principle, and then we'll kind of unpack that principle. The basic principle is this, all right? This is the basic principle. Hospitality is built upon the foundation of fellowship, and discipleship is often best done in the context of hospitality. Okay? Discipleship is built on the foundation of, hospitality is built on the foundation of fellowship. And discipleship is best done oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, in the context of hospitality. And it is certainly best done in the context of fellowship, right? Because it's very hard to receive corrective or instructive input from someone that you don't think shares things in common with you. From someone that you don't think, hey, that's my kind of person right there. Those are my people, right? Now, as humans, we're all bad about making assumptions about people and all that kind of thing. And I get that, and I understand that. But it's just a psychological truth. We receive instruction, correction, training better from somebody that we think is one of us. It's just how we as humans work. So as you can see, there's kind of a reciprocal relationship among these three concepts. And we see that in Paul, or I should say in Acts, right? We see that in our text. So they take Apollos home, Priscilla and Aquila take Apollos home. They instruct him more adequately in the way of Jesus. What does that mean? Well, I suspect that what Apollos was doing was he had never actually heard of Jesus, but he had been reading the Old Testament and realized, wait a minute, I think the Messiah has to suffer. And all of a sudden, Priscilla and Aquila are like, we got your suffering Messiah right here. So they take him home, they instruct him about what happened to Jesus, and now all of a sudden, the pieces fall into place for Apollos. And now, not only does Apollos have a better understanding of the gospel, but now he also has supporters for his next phase of ministry. Okay? So have this mutual upbuilding, this mutual encouragement. Now, there are lots of ways we could unpack this. One of the reasons that there is this sort of mutual relationship is because hospitality is a place where people can, as we already said, where people can ask questions, they can raise concerns. It provides an emotionally and socially safe environment for discipleship. And that emotionally and socially safe environment then encourages people to talk. It encourages them to share about what's really going on in their lives. And it also facilitates the communication of wisdom, right? Now, what is wisdom? Well, that's a whole other sermon series, but we can summarize it by saying wisdom is knowledge applied to real life. Wisdom is knowledge applied to real life. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's what wisdom is. Now, as we've already observed, hospitality also embodies the very virtues that we are telling people about when we are instructing them about the Christian life. And hospitality even gives them practical guidance in how to live out those virtues, because they see it modeled. It gives people, and it even gives people laboratories in which to practice some of those foundational skills, being loving, being patient, being self-controlled. Because, if you're hospitable long enough, something's going to go wrong, right? The tea jug's going to get knocked over. The plate of spaghetti is going to get dropped on the floor. Something's going to happen. And it gives you an opportunity to get practice. Okay? So there are lots of advantages to connecting our practice of fellowship, hospitality, and discipleship. And of course, one that I neglected to say is that hospitality reinforces those feelings of fellowship. And those things need to be reinforced every now and then. That's how we lean into building fellowship, is by spending time with one another. So sometimes you will hear people, maybe they've been exposed to Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Church, and they'll look at the fellowship part of it and they kind of sneer at that and say, oh, that's not really as important as all the rest of these. No, actually, fellowship, it's not something that can be programmed, really. I mean, you've got to have some programming support for it, but it's not something that can be programmed. It is still, nevertheless, exceedingly important, because without fellowship, true discipleship will not happen, because of the very nature of true discipleship. Now, I've got one practical challenge for you, and it's something Natalia and I just did yesterday. Invite someone to your home. Have a meal with them. Talk about spiritual things. Don't have an agenda necessarily, but just talk about spiritual things and give them an opportunity to share their story. That's a way, by the way, that you can also do evangelism. Now, some of you I know are thinking, preacher, you haven't been inside my house. It's a dumpster fire. And, that's okay. You can invite them out to a good place to eat and converse with them over a meal. It doesn't always have to be in your home. As some of us really are not. And some of you will be better at hospitality than others, okay? It's just kind of how it is. But I would encourage you, start those relationships. Have meals with people. Listen to their story and see where God leads you in the process. Let us pray.